Hi, grade fives. So we are going to continue on with the lesson we started last week about where the early French and British chose to settle and those early settlements that they created in parts of the maritime provinces in the 1700s. As a quick review, this would have been the map that we would have looked at last time, which showed four different examples of early settlements in some of those maritime provinces. You did do some research last time on, well, some of you might have chosen to do some research on the Fortress of Louisbourg. Today we're going to be looking at settlements in what is now known as New Brunswick and in PEI and what happened with that land through the 1700s. So when we talked about why the environment or how the environment influenced the British and the French when they were picking land to settle on, we realized that they were trying to acquire land and resources. And in a lot of those settlements, those examples of settlements from the book, we see that a lot of their choices were usually pieces of land that were close to water, so that they could get food. Um, or they were close to places where they could acquire more land or food in order to allow themselves to survive. And by the 1700s, the British had gained control over a lot of French territories. And we're going to see that today, especially when looking at New Brunswick and what they did in order to gain control and try to get the French people out of those places so that they could take full control. So in New Brunswick, the French and the British built on opposite sides of the Missaguash River, and both sides wanted control of this land because it was on a land bridge. Now, a land bridge is kind of like a piece of land that connects two land masses, and I'm going to show you the maps, and then I'll come back to this slide because what I've done is that I've put the maps of the settlements in Nova Scotia and the map of the settlements in New Brunswick close together, so you can see where the land bridge was. So here you can see Fort Beauséjour. So Fort Beauséjour would have been where the French would have settled in New Brunswick. This would have been one of their early settlements. Now, as you can see, Fort Beauséjour is actually incredibly close to this parcel of land here, which we obviously know as Nova Scotia. So they would have built one of their early settlements here in Fort Beauséjour, which is basically sharing a land bridge with Nova Scotia. The British built on the other side of this land bridge in Nova Scotia, and they created a settlement known as Fort Lawrence. So both the French and the British were competing for land, so they both built on either side of this land bridge. In 1755, Fort Beauséjour, which was the settlement I pointed out to earlier, which was close to Nova Scotia, but it was in New Brunswick, and it was the French settlement, was captured by the British. So they had Fort Lawrence, and then they would have obtained Fort Beauséjour in 1755. So your next question might be, well, if they obtained this land from the French, well, what happened to the French? The French ended up becoming deported. And deported means that they were sent away from their land, which in this case would have been Fort Beauséjour and other French settlements across the maritime provinces, to other places around the world. And they were basically all rounded up by the British and sent away. So the first roundup occurred at Fort Cumberland and continued until the 1760s. Most Acadians lost their homes, however, some also hid from the British and found ways to survive. So some did flee the situation. And if you would have done any research on Louisbourg, this definitely would have come up in your research about the British trying to capture Louisbourg and what they did with the Acadian people. So this should be a term you're kind of familiar with, but if not, that is what happened. It's what we know today as the Acadian deportation, and it's a very significant part of our culture, especially for those people who are Acadian. It's a very significant part of their history because now they have relatives all over the world. For example, I'm Acadian, and some of my relatives live in places like Louisiana in the United States. And that's because their ancestors, their older relatives who were around in those 1700s, were sent away by the British to different parcels of land, and Louisiana was one of those places. So that's just an example of how the deportation, even though it's not something we know a lot about or we really think about in our daily lives, it does affect where some of our relatives ended up. So looking at PEI, there were a few settlements in PEI, including Ile Saint-Jean. So Ile Saint-Jean was originally under French control, but later came under control of the British. And this was kind of part of an overall sort of mission of the British to just take all the land from the French and send them away. So established in 1720, it was part of Ile Royale, which we now know as Louisbourg. And if you look at the map, which I'm going to show you, you will see. So Ile Royale would have been somewhere up here, which is now known as Louisbourg. And Prince Edward Island, before it was known as Prince Edward Island, whole island was known as Ile Saint-Jean. So you can see that Ile Saint-Jean is very close to where Louisbourg would have been. So it was an important parcel of land for the French to have because, of course, it was very close to Louisbourg, which was one of their main settlements. The French also built a small military post at Port-le-Joie. So the Acadian farmers were encouraged to move here to produce food for Louisbourg. As I said, Louisbourg was one of the biggest French settlements, so they were using the land Ile Saint-Jean, which we now know as PEI, to use that land as farming, so they could have enough food produced for the settlement in Louisbourg. Some Acadians also went to Ile Saint-Jean to escape deportation from the British. However, by 1758, the British had taken over and had deported most people back to France. The British then built Fort Amherst at Port-le-Joie, and those soldiers were poorly paid and their living conditions were not good. And over time, fewer people were sent there. And by 1768, the remaining soldiers moved to Fort Edward. Fort Edward is in Nova Scotia and was one of the British settlements, and Fort Amherst was destroyed. And as you can see again, that's Ile Saint-Jean, and all of these red dots indicate different early French settlements that would have been created there before the British tried to seize that land. So today's assignment is going to be made up of two parts, and I will show it to you. The first part contains a question that you need to respond to, and the second one is an art piece that you're going to look at and you're going to answer questions about. So here's the PowerPoint. I've already made it for you, so you just have to fill it out. Part 1 is what were important factors for the English and the French for choosing sites for settlement. And you can kind of go back to the previous lesson too if you think that will help you answer this question. And which factor do you think was most important? And you have to give me a reason why you think that. So that's kind of a two-part question for part 1. Your response can go on this slide here. You can make the font smaller so that it fits. Part two, I have an art piece here. It's called Ships Take Acadians into Exile by Claude Picard. So you're going to look at the image and you're going to answer some questions about it. And I've done each of the questions for this on separate slides so that you have lots of space. So it says to read the title, the caption, and the artist's name and record them here. So where I have your response will go here, you can backspace that, get rid of that, and just write your answer. And you can figure that out just by going to the previous slide and looking at the description at the bottom. The next question is, what's happening in the image and where is it taking place? So again, your response will go at the bottom. Try to think of where it might be taking place. Maybe use some of the maps included in the PowerPoint to take a guess. Who is shown in the image and how are the people shown? And when I say how are the people shown, I mean look at the expressions on their faces. What kind of emotions do you think that the artist is trying to show the viewer? And again, your response will go down at the bottom. If you need extra space for that question, just create a new slide and write it on there as well. The last question is there something or someone missing? And what do you think the main idea of this art piece is? And that's it. That is the assignment for today, just that part one, that two-part question. And the second part is to look at the art piece I've given and to answer some questions about what you think the image is trying to show the viewer. So that's the assignment. If you have any questions, you can message me in the classroom, send me a Gmail, comment on the assignment, and good luck, and we'll be chatting soon. Bye.